Welcome, and thank you for being here tonight. Settle in, let your body find its stillness, and allow the cares of the day to drift away like smoke on a cool evening breeze. Tonight we're going to travel somewhere ancient and vast, not to a city of steel and glass, but to a realm of gold and shadow, of deep magic and older grief, where the gods themselves were not so different from the rest of us in the ways that mattered most. This is the story of Loki, not the monster that legends made of him, not the villain that fear required, but the whole complicated soul beneath the performance, the brilliant, restless, heartbroken being who spent an eternity searching for the place where he truly belonged and found it finally in the most unexpected way imaginable. There is no need to hold tightly to every detail tonight. Simply let the story carry you, the way deep water carries something gently placed upon its surface. Rest now and listen. Before Loki, there was light, air. Not the tentative, apologetic light of early morning, but the full, confident radiance of a realm that had existed long enough to believe in its own permanence. Asgard rose from the void of space not as something constructed, but as something that had simply decided to be. Towers of pale gold catching the eternal sun at angles that made the entire city seem to glow from within, as though the stones themselves remembered warmth and chose to keep it. The streets were wide and worn smooth by centuries of use, lined with the kinds of trees that grow only where time has been generous, their roots so deep and their canopies so broad that they had become as much a part of the architecture as the buildings themselves. The air smelled of metal and rain and something green and wild that came from the distant forest beyond the city walls, and in the quieter hours of the Asgardian day, when the training grounds were still and the great halls had not yet filled with the noise of evening, you could hear that wildness breathing at the edges of everything civilized. It was a kingdom that had earned its confidence. Thousands of years of history had shaped Asgard into something genuinely formidable, not merely powerful in the way that a sword is powerful, but powerful in the way that a river is powerful, capable of both sustaining and destroying, depending on what it chose to do with itself in any given moment. The All-Father Odin had ruled it for longer than most of its inhabitants could fully comprehend, his reign stretching back to an era when the 9 realms were still sorting out the terms of their relationships with one another, when alliances were made in blood, and the distances between worlds were crossed by warriors who did not always come home. He had seen empires rise in the lesser realms and collapse back into the earth. He had watched civilizations make the same mistakes in different costumes over and over, with the particular patience of someone who understood that wisdom could not be given, but only accumulated slowly, through the repeated experience of being wrong. Odin was not a simple man, if man was even the right word for what he was. His face in those years before everything changed carried the specific expression of someone who has spent a very long time thinking about a very complicated problem without arriving at a solution that satisfies him completely. The single eye that remained to him, the other sacrificed long ago in exchange for something he considered worth the cost, held a quality of attention that could be uncomfortable to receive directly, as though it were seeing not just the surface of things, but the entire depth behind them. He was not unkind. He was in fact capable of great and genuine tenderness, particularly in the private hours when the requirements of kingship had been set aside for the evening, and he sat beside Frigga in the quiet of their shared rooms, talking about nothing in particular in the easy way of people who have run out of secrets and found the absence of them peaceful. Frigga was, in many ways, the more interesting sovereign. She held no formal throne, occupied no official role that the histories would rush to record, and yet Asgard without her would have been a fundamentally different place, sharper, colder, more efficient in the way that things are efficient when they have been stripped of their warmth. She was a practitioner of Seidr, the deep and subtle magic of foresight and transformation that Asgardian culture had never quite decided how to categorize. Too powerful to dismiss, too feminine in its character to fully celebrate in a warrior civilization, too useful in practice to abandon. Frigga used it the way she used everything, quietly, precisely, and in service of the people she loved. She had a gift for understanding what someone needed before they had found the language to express it themselves, and she extended that understanding without requiring gratitude or acknowledgement in return. To be loved by Frigga was to be seen entirely and still chosen, which is perhaps the most generous form that love can take. their son Thor arrived into this world like the thing he would one day embody, loudly, with great energy, and accompanied by a sense of occasion that made everyone in the vicinity feel that something significant had just occurred. He was a golden child in the most literal sense, fair-haired and broad-shouldered even in early youth, possessed of a physical confidence that seemed less like arrogance than simple accuracy. He was in fact stronger than almost everyone around him, faster, more capable of absorbing punishment and returning it, and he knew this the way a tree knows it is tall, not as a boast, but as an ordinary fact about the nature of things. The Asgardians adored him with the wholehearted enthusiasm of people recognizing their own ideal reflected back at them in living form. He was brave, he was generous with his laughter, he was loyal to his companions beyond the point that strategy would recommend, and he had the particular gift of making everyone in his immediate vicinity feel that the world was fundamentally manageable, that its problems could be addressed with sufficient will and sufficient strength, that the future was a place worth moving toward with confidence. He was also, in these early years, somewhat limited in his understanding of the things that could not be lifted or fought. This was not a criticism but an observation. He had been given every tool he needed to be the warrior and king that Asgard required, and he had applied himself to developing those tools with genuine dedication. The subtler arts, patience, doubt, the willingness to sit with a question longer than was comfortable, rather than reaching for the nearest available answer, these would come later, paid for in the usual currency of suffering and loss. In the meantime, he was magnificent, and Asgard was glad of him, and he moved through his youth like someone who has never seriously considered the possibility that the world might not accommodate them. It was into this world, complete, confident, already furnished with its golden air, that Odin brought something small and cold from the frozen battlefields of Jotunheim. The war with the frost giants had ended in the way that wars between cosmic powers tend to end, not with the clean resolution of a decisive victory, but with an arrangement that satisfied no one entirely and committed everyone to a precarious stability. Jotunheim was vast and ancient and deeply strange, a world of perpetual cold where the indigenous giants lived at scales that made ordinary contact with them a disorienting experience, where the landscape itself seemed to participate in the hostility of its inhabitants. The conflict had been brutal and prolonged, and Odin had prevailed in it through a combination of military force and the particular ruthlessness that he wore lightly but carried always, the willingness to do what was necessary, even when what was necessary was genuinely terrible, in service of the larger peace. On the last day of the war, moving through the ruins of a Jotun temple in the frozen dark, Odin had found an infant. He had been left on a stone altar in the heart of the temple, placed with the deliberate care that suggests an act not of abandonment but of offering, or perhaps of strategic sacrifice, the leaving behind of something inconvenient in hopes that circumstances would resolve the inconvenience without requiring direct action. The child was small, far smaller than any frost giant infant should have been, which was already an anomaly that spoke to something unusual in his origins. He had gone silent in the cold, his breathing shallow and his colour the pale blue-grey of deep ice, and he watched the approaching figure of the Allfather with eyes that were at that moment the red of Jotun blood, and would not remain that colour for very long. Odin stood and looked at this child for a long time. What he thought in those moments, he never fully explained to anyone, including the child himself, and that silence would cost them both more than either of them could have anticipated. Perhaps he saw a political opportunity, a frost giant prince raised as Asgardian, a living bridge between the realms, an instrument of future diplomacy. Perhaps he saw something of himself in the specific quality of the child's aloneness, an echo of his own early experiences of isolation and necessity. Perhaps, in some wordless way that the rational mind would have been embarrassed to acknowledge, he simply could not leave a living thing to die on a stone altar in the dark when he had the power to prevent it. He lifted the child. The blue skin shifted immediately at his touch, responding to Asgardian warmth or to some deeper magic that Odin carried within him, transforming through a ripple of subtle colour until it was the pale tone of Asgardian skin. The red eyes faded to a clear and startling green. The child, who had been silent and still, made a small sound. Not quite distress, not quite comfort, but something suspended between them, which was perhaps an appropriate beginning. Odin carried him home across the sky, through the machinery of the Bifrost, back to the golden light of Asgard, where Frigga was waiting and the realm continued in its confidence, unaware that something had just arrived that would one day shake it to its foundations and in doing so, reveal what it was truly made of. The child had no name yet. He would be given one that meant nothing to him by birth and everything to him by experience, and he would spend the better part of eternity deciding what he thought about the difference. The child who arrived in Asgard with no name and no history was given both within the first days of his new life, and neither of them told the complete truth about what he was. He became Loki Odinson, Prince of Asgard, second son of the All-Father and the Queen, who had been waiting in the golden light when his new father carried him home. Frigga received him with the particular calm of someone who had already decided before the arrival what her answer would be. She held him with the confidence of a woman who understood that love was not a feeling that preceded commitment, but a practice that followed from it, and she began that practice immediately, completely, in the way that would define their relationship for as long as both of them existed. Loki grew in Asgard the way a plant grows in soil that is mostly but not entirely right for it, reaching toward the light with genuine eagerness, putting down roots that held, producing something real and living and in many ways beautiful, while somewhere beneath the surface, in ways that would not become visible for a long time, something about the fit was not quite perfect. This was not anyone's fault in the simple sense of that phrase. Frigga loved him without reservation. Odin provided for him with the full resources of a king's capacity. Thor, older by enough years to occupy a different world but young enough to be genuinely delighted by a brother, welcomed him with the open-handed warmth that was already his most characteristic quality. The household was not cold, the household was not cruel. And yet, the earliest memories that Loki would have been able to describe, if anyone had thought to ask him while they were still forming, were not memories of grand events or significant occasions, but of textures and atmospheres, the specific quality of the light in the palace library in the late afternoon, when it came through the high windows at an angle that turned the dust motes in the air into something almost ceremonial, and the shelves of accumulated knowledge receded into a comfortable dimness that felt like being held. He spent more time in that library than anywhere else from very early in his childhood. Not because anyone directed him there, but because the library asked nothing of him that he could not provide. The books did not require him to be stronger or louder or more demonstrably present than he naturally was. They simply offered themselves, and he accepted, and the transaction was clean and uncomplicated in a way that few of his other interactions in those early years managed to be. He was a quiet child in the way that certain kinds of highly active minds produce quiet children, the stillness on the surface concealing an interior that was in constant rapid motion, processing and sorting and connecting, building elaborate structures of understanding from whatever materials were available. He watched people the way a scientist watches an experiment, with genuine interest and careful attention, and the specific patience that comes from believing the data will eventually yield something meaningful if you simply observe long enough without disturbing the conditions. Adults found this quality alternately charming and unsettling depending on their own comfort with being observed, and the children who became his earliest companions tended to be the ones who were secure enough in themselves not to find his attention threatening. Thor, by contrast, was already the sun around which everything else in their immediate world oriented itself. This was not an exaggeration, or a retrospective distortion produced by later events. It was simply the accurate description of a personality so large and so genuinely luminous that proximity to it changed the character of whatever surrounded it. Where Loki was still, Thor was in motion. Where Loki spoke carefully and precisely, Thor spoke with the exuberant imprecision of someone who trusted that his meaning would be received regardless of how exactly it was packaged. Where Loki made friends through the slow accumulation of demonstrated reliability, Thor made them in moments, through the force of a smile or a shared laugh, or the generous willingness to simply be delighted by another person's existence. They loved each other. This is the important thing to hold on to through everything that comes later. They loved each other genuinely, in the specific way of children who grow up sharing the same corridors, and the same meals, and the same occasional reprimands from the same parents, who know each other's habits and fears and embarrassing preferences before either of them has developed the sophistication to curate what they reveal. There was nothing performed about it in those years. Thor would find Loki in the library and sit beside him for hours without needing to understand what he was reading, content simply in the company. Loki would watch Thor's training sessions from the gallery above the practice yard with the combination of genuine admiration and private analytical attention that was already his signature way of being interested in something, appreciating the spectacle while simultaneously cataloguing its mechanics. When they quarrelled, which they did with the frequency and intensity of children who are closely enough bonded to genuinely infuriate each other, the quarrels resolved quickly, leaving no lasting residue, because neither of them had yet learned to hold grievances across time. The differences between them were visible early, but in those years they functioned as complementary rather than divisive. Asgard had room, in principle, for both the warrior and the scholar, the hammer and the mind, the son who would command armies and the son who would understand things that armies could not address. There was a version of their shared childhood in which these differences produced a genuine and lasting partnership, in which the realm they would eventually inherit was made stronger by having both of them at its centre. That version existed as a possibility for a long time before events conspired to foreclose it, and the sadness of Loki's story is inseparable from the awareness that the better version was always available, always just slightly out of reach. The training that Asgardian princes received began early and covered a comprehensive range of disciplines, from physical combat through diplomatic history, through the theoretical foundations of magic and cosmology. Loki engaged with all of it, but with a selectivity that became apparent fairly quickly to anyone paying close attention. He was competent with weapons, more than competent, genuinely skilled, with the particular precision that comes from approaching physical training analytically rather than instinctively. But he was not Thor. He would never be Thor in the ways that the instructors who stood at the front of the training halls most valued, and some of them communicated this, not cruelly but thoughtlessly, in the small accumulated ways that thoughtlessness communicates itself. The comparison was never quite stated directly. It did not need to be. It was present in every moment when Thor's performance produced immediate enthusiastic acknowledgement, and Loki's equally fine performance produced something more measured, more qualified, more prefaced with what he was not before arriving at what he was. What he was, in those early years of magical study, was extraordinary. Frigga recognized it first because Frigga had the gift of recognizing things that had not yet announced themselves, and because she was already watching him with the particular quality of attention that she gave to things she loved and wanted to understand. The day she offered to teach him the deeper disciplines of Seidr herself, rather than leaving his education to the court instructors who handled it as a minor supplement to physical training. Loki was perhaps 8 or 9 years old in the reckoning that Asgardians used for their children, and he looked at her with an expression that contained, in its mixture of hope and careful restraint, the entire emotional vocabulary of a child who has learned not to expect too much from good news before it has been fully confirmed. She taught him every afternoon in her private rooms, where the light was different from the library light, warmer, more deliberate, filtered through hangings of deep colour that she had chosen herself over many years. She was a patient teacher with high standards, which is the best combination, and she had the wisdom to understand that Loki's intelligence required a specific kind of engagement. Not simplification, but precision, not encouragement alone, but genuine challenge, not the protection of his confidence through easy success, but the building of real capability through honest difficulty. He flourished under this approach with the undisguised relief of someone who has finally been given the appropriate tools for a task they have been attempting with the wrong ones. Magic, in Loki's hands, seemed less like something he had learned, and more like something he had remembered. The foundations of illusion work that took other students months to master, he absorbed in days. Not because he was rushing, but because the underlying principles seemed obvious to him in the way that certain kinds of knowledge are obvious to the mind shaped to receive them. He could hold an illusion stable for longer than students years his senior, could layer them with a complexity that produced images indistinguishable from reality, could feel the construction of them with a precision that allowed him to make adjustments no one else could detect. Frigga watched this and said nothing excessive about it, which was its own form of respect. She treated his gifts as facts rather than occasions for performance, which taught him to do the same. Transformation came next, and then perception. And then the subtler disciplines that did not have simple names. The arts of understanding the underlying structure of things, of reading the intentions and emotional states of others with an accuracy that went beyond ordinary intuition, of being present in a space without disturbing it, of moving through the world in ways that left fewer traces than ordinary movement. He learned all of it with the deep satisfaction of someone whose education has finally caught up with their capacity, and the afternoons with Frigga became the fixed point around which the rest of his days organised themselves. Outside those afternoons, he was still navigating the more complex social geography of a childhood, lived in the shadow of a brother who occupied so much of the available light. He was not without friends. He had companions who valued his intelligence, his dry and precise humour, his reliability in a crisis, his ability to plan several steps further ahead than anyone else in whatever group he found himself part of. But these friendships had a quality that was subtly different from the easy, warm, physical camaraderie that surrounded Thor wherever he went. They were more considered, more deliberate, more dependent on the specific compatibility of the individuals involved, which made them in some ways deeper and in other ways more fragile. The mischief began in this period, and it is worth understanding what it actually was before the later years gave it a darker colouring in retrospect. It was not malice, it was restlessness, the overflow of a mind operating well above the capacity of its daily requirements, seeking stimulation and experiment, and the specific pleasure of watching a cleverly constructed situation unfold according to its internal logic. The schemes were small and inventive, and occasionally inconvenient for their targets, but they had the quality of puzzles rather than attacks, the quality of a craftsman testing the properties of materials rather than someone with a grievance to express. He was interested in what people would do under unexpected conditions. He was interested in the gap between how things appeared and how they actually were. He was interested in the mechanics of surprise, the architecture of the moment when reality declines to behave as expected. Thor found most of this genuinely funny, which mattered more than Loki could easily have said. There is a particular kind of confirmation that laughter provides, the confirmation that someone sees you clearly and is not frightened by what they see. And Thor's laughter at Loki's schemes, offered without hesitation, and without the qualifying nervousness that some of the others showed, was one of the consistent sources of uncomplicated warmth in Loki's childhood. They got into trouble together. They stood in front of Odin together and received the consequences of their adventures with the specific solidarity of children who have agreed in advance that the shared experience is worth the shared cost. In those moments of minor transgression and mutual accountability, they were simply brothers, without the weight of destiny or difference, and the simplicity of it was something Loki would carry with him for a very long time. But the simplicity had limits that became more apparent as they grew older, and the world began to organise itself more insistently around the question of what they would each become. Thor's future was clear and celebrated. The warrior king, the golden heir, the continuation of everything that Asgard understood itself to be. Loki's future was less legible, to others and to himself, and the illegibility of it produced in him a quality of watchfulness that was something more than his natural observational habit. He was watching for information. He was watching for evidence of where exactly he fit in the story that Asgard was telling itself about its own future, and the evidence was not always reassuring. He was loved. He was genuinely, substantially loved by his mother completely, by his brother in the complicated, wholehearted way of someone who loves without always understanding, by his father in ways that Odin's emotional reticence made difficult to receive as clearly as they were meant. He was loved, and he was valued, and he was, in some way that he could feel, but not yet name, not quite in the place the story had been built for him to occupy. The fit was real. The fit was also, in some register below conscious awareness, slightly off, a note that was almost right, almost exactly what the music required, but carrying within it a frequency that the ear of someone paying close attention could hear as something other than perfect. He did not know yet what that frequency meant. He would not know for a long time. But it was there, woven into the texture of his childhood like a thread of a different colour, running through cloth that is otherwise consistent, invisible unless you were looking for it. Unmistakable once you had learned to see, the thread of difference that ran through Loki's childhood became, as he grew older, increasingly legible as something specific. Not a deficiency, not a wound, but a particular kind of orientation toward the world that expressed itself most completely in the practice of magic, and that revealed, in its full development, an intelligence shaped for questions that Asgard did not always know how to ask. Magic in Asgard occupied a complicated position. It was real, it was powerful, it was woven into the foundations of the realm's history and the deepest practices of its most revered figures. And yet the culture that had grown up around warrior virtue and physical conquest had never quite resolved its relationship with the arts that operated through subtlety rather than force, through perception rather than impact, through the patient manipulation of hidden structures rather than the direct application of overwhelming strength. Seidr was respected in the abstract and quietly condescended to in practice, acknowledged as necessary and simultaneously treated as something that real warriors supplemented their abilities with, rather than centered their identities around. It was Frigga's domain, and Frigga was loved, but the love Asgard extended to her had always contained within it a trace of the particular condescension that powerful cultures extend to the things they depend on, but do not fully understand. Loki understood this dynamic before he had words for it, in the way that children who pay close attention to adults understand the gap between what adults say and what they mean. He watched how the court responded to demonstrations of physical power and how it responded to demonstrations of magical precision, and he noted the difference in the quality of the attention. The first received with the immediate, uncomplicated admiration that Asgardians reserved for things that confirmed their self-image. The second received with something more reserved, more qualified, more tinged with the slight discomfort of encountering excellence in a domain one has not entirely decided to value. He filed this information away without immediately knowing what to do with it, which was his characteristic response to information that had not yet found its context. What he could do, by the time he was moving through the middle years of his Asgardian education, was genuinely remarkable by any honest measure. The illusions he constructed had achieved a complexity that went well beyond anything the court instructors had expected from a student his age. Not merely visual representations, but fully sensory environments, complete with sound and texture and the subtle atmospheric details that distinguish a lived space from a painted backdrop. He could populate these illusions with figures that moved and spoke and responded with enough apparent independence that even careful observers sometimes required extended examination to identify the artifice. The craft demanded by this level of construction was immense. The sustained concentration, the simultaneous management of multiple independent elements, the constant fine adjustment required to keep the whole coherent as conditions changed around it. He made it look effortless, which was itself a kind of additional skill, the skill of concealing the labour within the product. Frigga watched all of this with the quiet satisfaction of a teacher who has had the rare experience of encountering a student whose development exceeds the bounds of what the curriculum was designed to produce, and who must decide in real time how to continue serving that development. She expanded her teaching accordingly, moving into territories of magical theory and practice that she had not initially intended to cover for years yet, following Loki's capacity rather than her original plan, trusting that the plan existed to serve the student rather than the other way around. Their afternoons lengthened. The conversations that accompanied the practical work became increasingly philosophical, ranging across questions about the nature of reality and perception, about what it meant to change the appearance of something versus changing its substance, about the relationship between the world as it was observed and the world as it actually existed beneath observation. These conversations were among the most nourishing experiences of Loki's young life, and the nourishment they provided was of a specific kind, the kind that comes from being taken seriously by someone whose seriousness you respect. From having your questions treated as genuinely interesting rather than merely precocious, from discovering that the things you find most compelling about existence are things that another person finds equally compelling and has spent far longer thinking about. Frigga was not a simple woman, and she did not offer Loki a simple education. She offered him the real thing, with all its difficulty and ambiguity intact, and he received it with a gratitude that he could not always express directly, but that was present in everything about the quality of his attention when he was with her. The transformations he learned to work upon himself came later than the illusory arts, and they came harder, which surprised him initially given how naturally everything else had developed. To change the appearance of an external object, or to construct an image from nothing, required a certain kind of outward-directed attention, a projection of will and imagination into the space outside the self. To change oneself was a different operation entirely. It required turning that same precise attention inward, toward the very instrument that was doing the attending, which produced a kind of recursive complexity that even Loki's unusually ordered mind found genuinely challenging. There was also something else in the difficulty, something that Frigga recognized but waited for him to identify himself, which he eventually did with the specific quality of reluctance that surrounds true perceptions. To transform himself, he had to be willing to look at himself clearly first, to know, with precision, what he was actually working with before he could decide what to change it into. And looking at himself clearly required a sustained honesty about his own nature that was, even at this relatively young age, not entirely comfortable. He was good at observing others with accuracy and without flinching. Turning that same unflinching accuracy on himself was a skill that would take him considerably longer to develop, and that he would spend much of his life finding ways to avoid the necessity of. But the transformations, once he began to master them, opened something in him that the illusory arts had gestured toward without fully reaching. There was a freedom in them that he had not anticipated, not the freedom of escape exactly, but something more nuanced, the freedom of discovering that identity was not as fixed as it appeared to be, that the boundaries of the self were more permeable than the culture around him generally acknowledged, that what you are was in some meaningful sense a question that remained open for longer than most people allowed. He transformed into animals first, as students of the art traditionally did, birds for the quality of flight and the radical reorientation of spatial perception it produced, wolves for the different sensory hierarchy, smaller creatures for the experience of inhabiting a fundamentally different relationship with scale and vulnerability. Each transformation was revelatory in a way that was difficult to describe to someone who had not experienced it. Not simply the acquisition of different capabilities, but the temporary inhabitation of a completely different way of being in the world, a different set of priorities and perceptions and instinctive responses. He returned from each transformation changed in small ways that accumulated, not destabilized. His sense of himself remained coherent across the variations, but expanded, as though each new form had added a room to an interior house that was already larger than most people suspected from the outside. Frigga observed these returns with her characteristic attentiveness, and said, once, something that stayed with him across all the years that followed, that the gift of transformation was not the ability to become other things, but the discovery, through becoming other things, of what remained constant across all the variations. He thought about that for a long time without being entirely sure he understood it. He would come to understand it eventually. The understanding would cost him more than she had intended when she offered it. The perception arts, the ability to read the emotional and intentional states of others, to detect concealment and misdirection, to understand the hidden structures beneath the visible surfaces of social interaction, developed in him so naturally that for a long time he did not realize they constituted a learned skill rather than ordinary observation practiced attentively. He simply noticed things. He noticed the micro-expressions that crossed faces when people said one thing and meant another. He noticed the pattern of where people's eyes moved when they were constructing a narrative rather than remembering one. He noticed the small physical tells that accompanied strong emotion being suppressed, the controlled breathing, the deliberate stillness of hands that wanted to move, the particular quality of attention that people directed toward things they were trying not to look at too directly. He noticed all of this continuously, automatically, as a kind of background processing that required no conscious effort, and the result was that he moved through the social world with significantly more information than most of his contemporaries, which was both an advantage and, in its own way, a source of a particular kind of loneliness. Knowing what people were feeling beneath what they were saying created a gap between his experience of interactions and theirs that was difficult to bridge. When a conversation had a visible surface and an invisible substrate, and he was navigating both simultaneously, while his interlocutor was navigating only the surface, genuine meeting required him to either reveal that he was operating at the deeper level, which most people found unsettling, or to pretend that he was operating only at the surface, which was its own form of performance. He became, gradually and without fully intending to, very skilled at the performance of ordinariness, at presenting a version of his engagement with the world that matched what others expected to encounter, which meant that the truest and most interesting parts of his interior life became increasingly private, shared only in the afternoons with Frigga and, in a different register, in the library where the books did not require him to calibrate his responses for an audience. Language was the art that threaded through all the others and gave them their characteristic Lokean quality. He had always been a precise speaker, not formally, not in the stiff manner of someone who has memorized the rules of rhetoric, but with the natural precision of someone who genuinely cares about the relationship between words and the things they are meant to describe. He understood that language was not simply the vehicle for meaning, but a constituent part of it, that the words chosen to describe a thing changed what the thing was in the minds of those who received the description, that the same event narrated in a different language became, in some meaningful sense, a different event. This understanding made him a formidable conversationalist and an occasionally destabilizing presence in discussions where others had not considered that the framing of a question was itself a choice with consequences. It also made him aware, in a way that was sometimes uncomfortable, of the language that the world used to describe him. He noticed the specific words that appeared in accounts of his mischief versus accounts of Thor's equivalent behavior, the same underlying action attracting descriptors like troublemaking when it was his and high spirits when it was his brother's, the same cleverness called cunning in his case, in a tone that carried within it the faint unease that Asgardian culture attached to intelligence that operated through indirection. He noted these linguistic choices the way he noted everything, carefully, without immediate reaction, filing them for later consideration. He did not draw large conclusions from them yet, but they were there, in the accumulated record of his observations, contributing to a picture that he was not entirely ready to look at directly. What Frigga understood about all of this, and what she tried in her patient way to communicate without forcing the understanding before he was ready to receive it, was that Loki's gifts were not secondary gifts. They were not the consolation prize awarded to the child who would not be king, not the lesser alternative to physical prowess that a generous assessment might concede had its own modest value. They were, in their full development, among the most extraordinary capabilities that any being in the Nine Realms possessed, the ability to understand the deep structure of reality, to perceive with accuracy what others could not perceive, to shape appearances and thereby shape the responses of those who encountered them. To move through the world with a combination of intelligence and flexibility that no amount of physical strength could match or substitute for. A realm that understood what it had in him would have built institutions around his gifts the way it built training grounds around Thor's. Asgard, as it existed, did not quite know how to do this, and the gap between what Loki was and what the world around him had created space for was one that neither of them had yet found a way to close. He continued in those years to be the boy who watched from the gallery while others trained below, who read while others competed, who asked the questions that made the room briefly uncomfortable before the conversation moved on to something safer. He continued to love his brother with the specific quality of love that survives the awareness of difference and chooses to persist anyway. He continued to sit beside Frigga in the warm afternoon light and learn things that the world had not yet decided how to value. And beneath all of it, the thread of a question that would not stay quiet. A question about the nature of the self, about what it meant to be what he was in the place he was, about what precisely remained constant across all the transformations, continued its patient work, waiting for the moment when the answer would become unavoidable. The question that had been working quietly beneath the surface of Loki's life for so many years finally found its answer on a day that began as something else entirely, as a celebration, as a beginning, as the kind of occasion that a realm builds toward for years and greets with the full weight of its accumulated anticipation. The great hall of Asgard had been prepared for Thor's coronation, with the meticulous care of people who understood that the ceremonies that mark transitions between one era and the next carry a significance beyond their immediate occasion, that they are the moments when a civilization pauses to confirm for itself who it is and what it values and where it believes it is going. The banners were hung, the guests were assembled. The All-Father stood at the centre of everything, holding the thread of a story that had been building for centuries, ready to pass it to the son who had been shaped to receive it. Loki stood to one side and watched, which was his characteristic position, and noticed things, which was his characteristic activity, and felt something that he would not have been able to name precisely in that moment. A compound emotion built from genuine love for his brother, genuine happiness at Thor's happiness, and something else beneath those things that he was not yet ready to examine directly. Not envy in its simple form, something more architectural than envy, something that had to do with the structure of the story being enacted and the specific place within it that had been built for him, which was a place adjacent to the centre rather than at it, a place defined primarily by its relationship to something else rather than by its own terms. The frost giants came. They came into the vault where the casket of ancient winters was kept, 3 of them moving through the darkness with the particular quality of intention that distinguishes a deliberate incursion from an accident. And the coronation was interrupted, and the chain of events that would end with Loki standing in an entirely different understanding of himself was set in motion. He did not know in those first moments of the interruption that he was among its architects. He would learn this later, and the learning would be its own separate reckoning. For now, he simply watched the celebration dissolve, and the council convene, and the debate about response begin, and he watched Thor's immediate instinct toward action, and Odin's immediate instinct toward restraint, and he said the careful, measured things that the situation seemed to call for, and somewhere beneath all of this the question continued its patient work. It was in the vault later, in the specific circumstances that he had partially arranged without fully understanding why he was arranging them, that the answer arrived. He touched the casket of ancient winters with his bare hand. The way one sometimes touches things one has been told not to touch, not from defiance exactly, but from the need to know, the compulsion to close the gap between what one has been told is true and what one can verify through direct experience. The cold of it should have been unbearable. The cold of it was not unbearable. The cold of it felt in some way that his mind registered with a clarity that cut through every other sensation, like something that recognized him. His hand changed. The skin shifted through a spectrum of colour that he had never seen on Asgardian skin, moving into the deep blue of Jotun flesh, and the change travelled up his arm and kept going, and the eyes that looked back at him from the nearest reflective surface were red, the red of Jotun blood, the red of the enemy, the red of the thing that Asgardian children were taught to fear before they were old enough to question the instruction. He stared at his own reflection for a moment that seemed to occupy more time than moments normally contain, and then Odin was there, and the casket was set aside, and the moment arrived that Odin had been postponing, with whatever combination of love and fear and miscalculation goes into the decision to defer a necessary conversation past the point where deferral remains a viable option. What Odin told him was true and inadequate and too late, and offered with the particular failure of emotional imagination that characterized the Allfather's most significant parenting decisions. The failure to understand that information delivered without sufficient context for the feelings it produces is not communication, but excavation. That to tell someone the foundational fact of their existence and then fall silent before the enormity of what that fact implies is not the same as telling them the truth. You were the son of Lofe. You were found in a temple. I took you. I raised you as my own. These were facts. They were accurate facts. And they landed in Loki's mind with the force of something that reorganizes everything it touches. Because a fact about one's origins is not simply an addition to one's existing self-understanding, but a revision of the entire structure upon which that self-understanding was built. He stood very still while Odin spoke, which was the stillness of someone whose interior world is moving very fast in several directions simultaneously. And he listened with the precision that was his most reliable tool, and he began, in real time, the process of retroactive rereading that the revelation required. Every memory he had of his own life was now subject to reinterpretation. Every moment of feeling subtly apart, of occupying the adjacent rather than the central position, of sensing that the fit was real but not quite perfect, all of it was now legible as something that had been trying to tell him the truth about himself, in the only language available to it. The language of accumulated sensation rather than explicit statement. The understanding arrived not as a single illumination, but as a series of smaller recognitions, each one clicking into place with a precision that was almost audible, each one making the next more inevitable. He was Jotun. He was the thing that Asgard had built an entire aesthetic of contempt around. He was what the stories told to children as illustrations of what was dangerous and other, and fundamentally incompatible with civilized existence. He was the monster in the myths he had grown up with, the figure whose defining characteristic in every account he had ever encountered was its opposition to everything Asgardian, its essential unredeemability, its status as problem to be solved rather than being to be understood. He had absorbed all of these stories. He had believed them with the uncomplicated confidence of someone who had no reason to interrogate the perspective from which they were told. And now the perspective had shifted without warning, without preparation, without any of the context that might have made the shift survivable in a different way, and what had been a story about others was suddenly, retroactively, irrevocably, a story about him. The cruelty of the specific discovery was not in the fact of his origins, but in the particular nature of what he was. If he had learned that he was the son of a different Asgardian family, or even of a being from one of the less mythologized realms, the revelation would have been disorienting but navigable. What he had learned was that he was the embodiment of the thing he had been most thoroughly taught to fear and despise, not metaphorically, not in some abstract sense, but literally, genetically, at the level of the casket's cold recognition of his touch. The self he had spent his entire life constructing, the Asgardian prince with the unusual gifts and the slightly imperfect fit, the beloved son of Frigga, the brother of Thor, the scholar and the trickster and the student of magic. All of this was real, all of this had genuinely happened, and all of it had been built on a foundation that was not what he had believed it to be. Both things were true simultaneously. The life was real, and the foundation was different from what he had thought, and the mind that was trying to hold both truths at once was not a mind that had been prepared for this particular exercise. He asked questions. He asked them in the careful, precise way that was his characteristic mode of inquiry. But beneath the precision was something that he could hear in his own voice, and that he suspected Odin could hear as well. A quality of barely managed urgency, the voice of someone who needs the answers not for intellectual reasons, but because the answers are the only thing that might stop the interior architecture from continuing to shift. Why did you take me? What did you intend? What was I meant to be in this plan that you made without my knowledge or consent? The questions were reasonable. The answers that Odin offered were not unreasonable. A bridge between the realms, an end to the old war, the chance to grow up in a place where his gifts could develop rather than being suppressed. These were not lies. They were not the complete truth either, and Loki's perception, which had spent decades learning to identify the gap between what was said and what was meant, registered the incompleteness, even as the rest of him was trying to process information that was already more than enough. Odin collapsed. The Odin sleep took him at exactly the moment when his son most needed him to remain present and continue the conversation, which was either a terrible coincidence or the body's wisdom in choosing the exit that the will was not strong enough to take deliberately, and either way the effect was the same. Loki was left standing in the sudden absence of the explanation he had not yet finished receiving, in a room that now felt like a different room than the one he had entered, with a self that was now a different self than the one he had been carrying all morning. And no one remained who could help him understand what to do with either. He went to Frigga. Of course he went to Frigga. Of course he. She was the fixed point, the constant across all variations, the person whose love had never contained within it any of the qualifications or complexities that made other love feel provisional. He found her in the rooms where they had spent so many afternoons together, and she held him the way she had held him when he was very small, in the way that bodies remember being held before they have developed the sophistication to deflect comfort. And for a moment the information receded, and there was only the fact of her. She confirmed what Odin had told him, because she had known for years and had chosen to wait for Odin to initiate the conversation, which was its own decision with its own consequences, and she told him that it had never mattered, that it had never changed anything about what he was to her, that the love she had for him was not conditional on the specific arrangement of his origins. He believed her. He believed her completely and without reservation, because Frigga had never given him reason not to, because her love was the one thing in his experience that had always been exactly what it presented itself as, because the perception that told him when others were concealing things beneath what they said showed him clearly that she was not concealing anything at all. He believed her, and the belief did not solve the problem, because the problem was not whether he was loved, but whether he knew who he was. And Frigga's love, however real and unconditional, could not answer a question about identity on his behalf. Something went cold inside him in those hours. Not the cold of Jotunheim, not the deep structural cold of a world built around permanent ice, but the cold of a fire that has been given insufficient air, the cold of something that has been burning continuously for a long time, finding its fuel suddenly altered in ways it does not know how to adapt to. He did not rage. He did not weep. Not then. He became very still in the way that precedes, rather than follows feeling, the stillness of someone who is receiving information that the emotional architecture has not yet caught up to, who is managing the interval between understanding and response by holding everything very carefully in place and not moving suddenly. The self he had been that morning was still there in all its particulars, the memories, the relationships, the accumulated experience of decades of a life that had been genuinely lived and genuinely loved, and that self now existed within a context that had changed, not superficially but at the foundational level, in a way that required every other element of the structure to be reassessed in light of the new information. He was still Loki. He was also something he had not known he was, something that the world he lived in had spent considerable effort teaching him to regard as antithetical to everything he valued about himself. The work of reconciling these two truths was not work that could be done in a single afternoon in Frigga's rooms, and he did not attempt to do it there. He simply held the information and allowed it to begin its long, slow, irreversible alteration of everything it touched, and tried to remain as still as possible in the interval before the consequences arrived. The stillness that Loki had maintained through the hours of revelation did not last, because stillness of that kind never lasts. It is not a resting state but a suspension, the held breath before the body insists on breathing again, and what comes after it is shaped by everything that accumulated during the interval. What came after, in Loki's case, was not the explosion that a simpler account of his story might lead one to expect, but something more labyrinthine and more dangerous than simple rage, a period of action undertaken from a mind that was operating under conditions of profound internal disruption, while maintaining, on its surface, the appearance of coherent purpose. He took the throne in Odin's absence, which was his right and his responsibility as the remaining prince, while Thor was banished to Midgard, and the Allfather slept his deep, unreachable sleep. He sat in the great chair and received the court and issued the pronouncements that the position required, and he did all of this with a competence that no one could reasonably criticize, because he was genuinely intelligent and genuinely capable, and the administrative functions of governance were not beyond him. But the person performing these functions was a person who had spent the intervening hours in a conversation with himself that had not arrived at any stable conclusions, and the decisions that emerged from that conversation bore the marks of a mind trying simultaneously to act coherently and to resolve questions that could not be resolved through action. The frost giants were admitted to Asgard through mechanisms that Loki arranged, and the admission led to the disruption of Thor's coronation that he had wanted disrupted, and he told himself various things about his reasons for wanting this that were partially true and did not constitute the complete truth. There was the genuine belief, not entirely unfounded, that Thor was not yet ready, that the impulsive, glory-seeking young man who had been about to receive the throne would have been a dangerous king in ways that were specific and predictable, and that someone paying careful attention could see clearly. There was the desire to delay, to create space in which the situation might resolve itself differently, to prevent a finality that felt premature. And beneath these things, in the place where honest self-examination would have found them if honest self-examination had been what he was practicing, there were feelings that had no policy justification, the feelings of a person who had just learned that the story being enacted around him was not the story he'd believed himself to be living, who needed the enactment to pause while he recalibrated his understanding of his own position within it. He went to Jotunheim, he went to his father, to Laufey, the king who had left an inconvenient infant on a temple altar and never looked back, and he sat across from the frost giant sovereign in the cold that was no longer merely cold to him, but something with a different quality now, something that carried the specific resonance of a place that had a claim on him he had not previously understood. He offered Laufey access to the sleeping Odin. He framed it as an opportunity, and Laufey received it as one, and neither of them was entirely honest with the other about the full architecture of their intentions, which meant the conversation had a surface and a substrate in the way that Loki had spent his life learning to identify. and the substrate of his own intentions was something he was not yet prepared to read clearly. He was searching for something. The searching took the form of manipulation and scheme because those were the tools he had developed and the tools he knew how to use. But the underlying motivation was not the consolidation of power in any straightforward sense. He was trying, in the chaotic and self-defeating way of someone whose usual methods of understanding are suddenly inapplicable to the most important problem they have ever faced, to find out who he was and what his life meant now that the foundations had shifted. He wanted to prove something, to Odin, to Asgard, to Thor, to himself, and the specific thing he wanted to prove kept shifting, as the events he had set in motion produced consequences he had not fully anticipated. Because plans made from disrupted minds rarely maintain their coherence all the way through to their execution. The confrontation on the Bifrost came at the end of a sequence of events that had each seemed, in the moment of their execution, like the logical next step of a plan that no longer had a clear endpoint. Thor had returned from Midgard changed, not dramatically, not in ways that announced themselves with trumpets, but changed in the specific way of someone who has been stripped of their certainties and found, in the stripping, something more durable than the certainties had been. He had returned and learned what had been done in the interval of his absence, and the confrontation between them had the particular quality of confrontations between people who love each other and have been acting, on both sides, from sources of pain that they have not been able to fully name or share. Loki had activated the Destroyer. He had made choices that had resulted in harm to people who had not deserved harm. He had done these things from a place of internal crisis so profound that the usual moral calibration, the one that had always quietly organised his understanding of what was acceptable and what was not, had been operating under conditions that compromised its function without eliminating it entirely. He knew, in some register, that what he was doing was wrong. He could not stop doing it, because stopping would have required a stillness he did not yet have access to, a willingness to simply sit with the devastation of the revelation without converting it into action, and that willingness was not something he had developed and could not be improvised. Thor stopped him on the Bifrost. They fought in the specific way of people who are fighting each other, and also fighting themselves, whose anger at the immediate opponent is inseparable from their anger at the situation and at the universe that produced it, and whose love for each other is present in the very fact of how seriously each takes what the other does. The bridge beneath them cracked and broke with the force of the conflict, and the sky above Asgard opened, and at the moment when the ending of the battle arrived, it arrived in the form of Odin. Odin awake, Odin present, Odin holding Thor's arm at the edge of the ruined bridge, with Loki at the other end of the configuration suspended over the void, held by Thor's grip through Gungnir, which Thor had brought as an anchor. What Loki said in that moment, and what he meant by it, and what it cost him to say it, are all things that the words alone do not fully convey. He told Odin that he could have done it, that everything he had done, the whole elaborate, damaging sequence of choices, had been in service of a goal that he had believed would finally produce the response he needed from his father. He had believed, in the way that wounded minds construct their beliefs, that if he could prove himself decisively, could bring Odin evidence of his worth in the specific currency that Odin valued, the revelation of his origins would be recontextualized, would become a complexity within an otherwise confirmed identity, rather than the destabilizing foundation shift it had produced. The word he used, asking whether any of it was ever enough, was the word of someone who had been asking that question, in different forms, for a very long time. Odin said no. Or rather, Odin said something that Loki heard as no, said it in the compressed, inadequate way of someone trying to communicate an enormous and complex truth, in the 2 words available before the physics of the situation became irreversible. And the words he chose landed in the place where Loki's need was greatest and were not equal to that need, and Loki let go. The letting go was the most significant act of his life up to that point, and it was interpreted in almost every subsequent account as either a suicide attempt or a dramatic gesture, and it was neither of those things in any simple sense. It was the physical enactment of an interior experience that had been building since the moment his hand changed colour in the vault, the experience of finding the ground gone, of reaching for the stable surface of a known identity and finding it no longer there, of the self that had been building its coherence for decades, discovering that the foundations were different from what it had believed, and not knowing, in that discovery, what shape it was supposed to take from here. He fell because there was nothing left to hold on to, and that sentence is both literally and entirely metaphorically accurate in equal measure. The fall through the void between worlds was long in ways that physical distance does not fully account for. The spaces between the realms are not simply the absence of matter, but the presence of something else, a kind of dimensional texture that has its own properties and pressures, and, for a being with sufficient sensitivity to the underlying structures of reality, its own information. Loki fell through all of this with the specific vulnerability of someone who has just had every organizing principle of their existence removed simultaneously, which meant that the void's particular qualities registered with a directness that a more defended mind might have been able to moderate. The darkness was not empty. That is the thing about the void that the word suggests but does not convey accurately. It was full of the kind of presence that exists beneath the ordinary surfaces of things, the deep structure that Loki's magical education had taught him to perceive, but had not prepared him to experience from inside, without the protective distance that observation normally provides. He was not outside the deep structure looking in at it. He was inside it, falling through it, and it was looking back at him with the particular indifference of something that exists at a scale where individual identity is a temporary and not especially significant phenomenon. What this did to him is difficult to describe without recourse to the language of dissolution, which is not quite accurate, and the language of revelation, which is not quite accurate either. It was something between the two, the experience of the self becoming uncertain about its own boundaries, which for a person whose entire psychological architecture had just been revealed to be built on misunderstood foundations, was not a neutral or manageable experience. The Loki who had sat in the library and learned magic and loved his brother and watched from galleries and built elaborate schemes from the materials of his considerable intelligence. All of that was still present, still constitutive, still real, and it was present in a context now of such radical uncertainty about what it meant that the continuity of the self was something he had to actively maintain rather than simply inhabit. He fell, and the void held him in its vast and indifferent embrace, and somewhere in the falling the particular quality of his grief clarified itself. He was not grieving the loss of a throne or the failure of a scheme or even, in the most superficial sense, the loss of a father's explicit approval. He was grieving the loss of the story he had told himself about who he was and where he belonged and what his life was building toward. The story that had sustained him through the imperfect fit and the adjacent position, and the long afternoons that were warm and specific and real, and had now been revealed to be situated in a context he had not understood. The story was gone, and without it the self that the story had organized was exposed as something that needed a new organizing principle, a new understanding of its own nature and meaning, and the void was not the place where such principles were easily found. He fell for what felt like a very long time, which may or may not correspond accurately to the duration of the fall as experienced from outside it. And at the end of the fall he was found. This is the part of the story where the darkness stops being simply the absence of light and becomes something more actively terrible, and it is the part that requires the most compassion to tell accurately. Because what happened next was not something that Loki chose from a position of freedom and understanding, but something that happened to a person who had arrived at the point of maximum vulnerability, with none of the resources that might have allowed him to recognize the danger of what was approaching. He was not the same when he arrived at the other end of the void as he had been when he let go of Gungnir on the Bifrost. The fall had not broken him in any simple sense. He was still recognizably himself, still in possession of his intelligence and his capabilities and the long accumulation of his experience. But he was himself in the condition of someone who has been stripped of the context within which that self understood its own value and direction, and a self in that condition is a self that is, in the specific and terrible sense of the word, available to be given a new story, a new organizing principle, a new account of who it is and what it is for, by whatever or whoever arrives first with something coherent to offer. What arrived first was not coherent in any honest sense, but it had the appearance of coherence, which to a mind in the condition Loki's mind was in at the bottom of the void was not entirely distinguishable from the real thing. And so the next chapter of his story began not with a choice but with a vulnerability, which is perhaps the most important thing to hold on to as the darkness that followed is examined, that the god who descended from the sky above a city of glass and metal and announced himself as its better was not acting from strength, but from the specific, terrible weakness of someone who had fallen too far and been caught by the wrong hands, and who did not yet have the resources to understand the difference. The hands that caught Loki at the bottom of the void were not gentle hands, and the story they offered him was not a kind story, and the coherence it provided was the coherence of a cage described in the language of liberation, which is a very old kind of deception, older than Asgard, older than the 9 realms as Loki had learned to understand them, as old as the particular human and inhuman tendency to offer purpose to the purposeless, in exchange for service that the purposeless, in their condition, are not positioned to evaluate clearly. The entity that found him was vast in the way that things are vast when they have existed long enough to have forgotten what smallness felt like. Thanos moved through the universe with the specific patience of someone who has decided that time is a resource he possesses in sufficient quantity to pursue his goals without urgency, and who has organized everything about his approach to existence around the single conviction that he understands something about the nature of reality that everyone else has failed to grasp. He was not, in the ordinary sense of the word, evil, or rather, he was evil in a way that was more unsettling than ordinary evil, because it was evil that had passed through the refinement of genuine intelligence and emerged on the other side convinced of its own righteousness. He believed what he said. This is perhaps the most important and most terrible thing about him, and it made him, as an influence on a mind already destabilized by loss and grief and radical uncertainty about its own nature, significantly more dangerous than simple malice would have been. Simple malice can be identified and resisted. It announces itself in the quality of its intentions, in the gap between what it offers and what it actually provides, in the coldness of its indifference to the well-being of its instruments. What Thanos offered was not simple malice. It was a framework, a complete, internally consistent account of the universe and its problems, and the role that a sufficiently capable being might play in addressing those problems. And it arrived at the moment when Loki had no framework of his own, when the one he had been operating within had just been dismantled by the revelation of his origins and the fall through the void, when the self that needed a story to organize itself around was sitting in the darkness without one, available in the terrible sense that Act 6 established to whatever arrived first with something that felt like ground beneath the feet. The beings who served as Thanos' intermediaries in those early interactions were themselves shaped by long proximity to their master's certainty, which had a quality of transmission, the way that absolute conviction tends to colonize the epistemic space around it, not through argument exactly, but through the sheer gravitational force of a mind that has organized itself completely around a single point. They spoke to Loki in the language of significance, of purpose, of the specific kind of importance that is extended to instruments that are being prepared for a particular use. And to a person who had spent his entire life feeling adjacent to significance, rather than at the center of it, this language had a pull that operated beneath the level of critical assessment. He was given a task. The task was the recovery of the Tesseract from the planet called Midgard, from Earth, from the world where Thor had spent his brief exile and found, apparently, something worth changing for. The framing of the task was elaborate and appealing to the specific qualities of Loki's intelligence. It was presented as a demonstration of his capabilities, as proof of what he could accomplish when given adequate resources and a clear objective, as the first movement of a plan that would end with him ruling something, which was offered as the thing he most wanted, and was in this period not entirely wrong, as an assessment of the shape of his longing, even if the specific form in which it was offered was a profound misreading of what the longing was actually for. What the longing was actually for was not power in the sense that Thanos and his servants understood it. It was not dominion, not the arrangement of other beings beneath oneself in hierarchies of submission, not the satisfaction of watching others kneel. It was something much more ordinary and much more human than any of that. Though Loki would have rejected the word human as a description of anything he felt. He wanted to be in the right place. He wanted to occupy a position in the story that was built for him rather than adjacent to someone else's position, that recognized what he actually was rather than requiring him to perpetually demonstrate his value in the currency of someone else's priorities. He wanted the specific piece of a person who has found the thing they are for and is doing it, which is perhaps the most fundamental want that any conscious being experiences, and which had been systematically frustrated by the circumstances of his life in ways that the discovery of his origins had clarified rather than resolved. Thanos did not offer him this. Thanos offered him a simulacrum of it, a version of significance that was contingent on usefulness, that would last exactly as long as he served the purpose he was being used for, that was in its essential structure the same adjacent to the centre position he had always occupied. Now elaborately reframed as something more. But Loki was not, in that period, in a condition to perceive the difference clearly. His perceptions, which had always been his greatest strength, were operating under conditions that compromised their reliability, not because he had become less intelligent or less perceptive in any absolute sense, but because the emotional disturbance produced by everything that had happened was creating interference in the signal, the way that turbulent water distorts the reflections that would be clear in stillness. The sceptre was placed in his hands. This is a fact that the subsequent account of his actions on Earth cannot be separated from, and it is a fact that requires more attention than it typically receives in retellings that are more interested in what Loki did than in the conditions under which he did it. The sceptre contained within it one of the Infinity Stones, a fragment of primordial power whose specific character was the manipulation of mind and will, of the connection between a conscious being and its own intentions, of the boundary between what a person chooses and what is chosen for them by influences they cannot perceive or resist. Loki carried this object across the void and through the portal and onto the planet he had been sent to, and he carried it in contact with his own consciousness, and the question of where his intentions ended and the stone's influence began was not a simple question with a clean answer. This is not offered as absolution. The actions that followed produced real consequences for real people, and consequences exist independently of the conditions that generate them, and nothing about the complexity of Loki's situation erases the harm that resulted from what he did. But the complexity is part of the truth, and a telling of the truth that omits it in favour of a simpler moral architecture is not actually more honest. It is less honest, dressed in the clothing of moral clarity. A person acting under the influence of a cognitively active Infinity Stone, in the aftermath of a psychological crisis severe enough to have produced the events of his fall, in the context of a coercive relationship with a being of overwhelming power who has explicitly threatened the consequences of failure, is a person whose agency is real but compromised, whose choices are genuine but constrained in ways that matter to any honest accounting. He arrived on Earth with his army, which was not his army in any meaningful sense. It was Thanos' army, extended to him as a resource the way a general extends troops to a lieutenant, with the implicit understanding that the troops serve the general's purpose through the lieutenant's direction rather than the lieutenant's purpose through their own autonomous choice. He arrived speaking the language of dominion that had been given to him, using the words of a conqueror because conqueror was the role he'd been assigned and was performing, and the performance had the particular quality of performances that are simultaneously genuine and hollow, genuinely enacted, genuinely capable of producing real effects in the world, and hollow at the centre where authentic motivation should be. The people he encountered on Earth were varied in their responses to him. Some were terrified, which was the intended response and produced in him something that was neither satisfaction nor discomfort, but a kind of dissociated observation, the part of his mind that was always watching, registering the data of their fear, without connecting it to the emotional valences that such data should have produced. Some were defiant, which he found more interesting in the way that he had always found resistance more interesting than compliance, because resistance required engagement, and engagement was something he could respond to with the full use of his actual capabilities rather than simply the performance of a role. And some, specifically a woman named Natasha Romanoff, who sat across from him in a German facility and spoke to him in the careful way of someone who is conducting an excavation rather than a conversation, seemed to be seeing him in a way that made his performance feel insufficient. The conversation with Romanoff is worth dwelling on because it was one of the few moments during the entire Earth episode when something beneath the performance was briefly visible, when the gap between the role he was playing and the person playing it became perceptible to someone paying the right kind of attention. She spoke to him as though she were not particularly frightened, which was interesting. She spoke to him as though she were not particularly impressed, which was more interesting still. She spoke to him as though she had some theory about what was actually happening inside the God of Mischief that she was in the process of testing. And the testing took the form of language that acknowledged his intelligence directly, while simultaneously declining to be organised by it, which was an unusual combination, and one that he found, despite himself, genuinely engaging. She named things. She named the loneliness of the kind of power he was performing, the specific emptiness at the centre of plans built entirely around the demonstration of superiority, the way that the desire to be above others is always a distorted expression of the desire to be with them, which is a more primary and more human want that certain kinds of pain have a way of converting into its apparent opposite. He responded to these observations with the contempt that the role required, and with the simultaneous awareness that the observations were not inaccurate, and the gap between those two things was something that Romanoff appeared to register. Because she was very good at her work, and her work required her to live in exactly those gaps, Thor found him. This reunion, if it could be called that, carried the full weight of everything that had passed between them. The coronation interrupted, the choices made from crisis, the fall from the Bifrost, the months in the void, and it was a weight that neither of them handled with particular grace, because grace in those circumstances was not what the moment produced. What it produced instead was the specific kind of interaction between brothers who have wounded each other badly and have not yet found a way to discuss the wounds directly, which looked from the outside like argument, and from the inside like grief wearing the costume of anger. Thor wanted him back. He wanted him back with the simple, stubborn warmth that was his most characteristic quality, and that Loki found simultaneously touching, and, in his current condition, nearly impossible to receive without the defensive apparatus that had become his primary mode of self-protection. To be wanted back required him to acknowledge that he had left, and to acknowledge that he had left required him to acknowledge why, and to acknowledge why required a degree of honest self-examination that the presence of the sceptre and the weight of Thanos' assignment and the still unresolved devastation of everything that had preceded the fall made unavailable to him in that moment. The defeat, when it came, arrived in the form most appropriate to a story about a God of Mischief, encountering the limits of mischief as a strategy for navigating the world. It came through a force that was entirely immune to cleverness, that operated according to principles so far outside the register of intelligence and strategy that no amount of wit or planning could have produced a useful intervention. The Hulk was the opposite of everything Loki had been trained to rely on, an expression of pure instinct and physical force that had no surface for his usual methods to find purchase on, and the encounter was brief and absolute, and contained within it a kind of cosmic irony that, in a different condition, he might have genuinely appreciated. The God of Mischief, flung repeatedly into concrete by a creature that thought in feelings rather than strategies, lying in a crater and contemplating the ceiling of a building that was not designed to accommodate the specific experience he was having, had the quality of a punctuation mark at the end of a very long and complicated sentence. He was captured and held and eventually transported back to Asgard in the company of his brother, who maintained throughout the journey the expression of someone carrying something very heavy that they have chosen to carry because setting it down would cost more than continuing. The chains on Loki's wrists were real, and the muzzle they placed on him was real, and the defeat was real, and all of these things were also, in the larger frame of the story, not quite what they appeared. Not the end of anything, not the final definition of who he was, but a pause, a forced stillness, the beginning of the long interior work that forced stillness sometimes makes possible when the noise of action has finally been removed. He rode back to Asgard through the sky, and the stars were the same stars they had always been, indifferent to the specific shape of one being's suffering, and somewhere beneath the performance of the captured villain, beneath the role that circumstances had assigned him and that he had been, for a period, playing with insufficient critical distance, the part of him that watched and noticed and remembered was still present, still taking in information, still building toward an understanding that was not yet complete, but that the coming months of stillness would, slowly and at considerable cost, begin to make possible. Asgard received its returned prince the way that kingdoms receive complicated truths, with the formal apparatus of judgment masking the deeper, messier reality of a family that did not know how to talk about what had happened, and was using ceremony as a substitute for conversation. The chains that had been placed on Loki for the journey were not removed when he arrived. The muzzle was. Odin ordered that much, at least, perhaps recognizing that silence imposed by metal was a different thing from the silence that a person chooses, and that whatever was going to happen next would require words, even if no one was quite prepared for what those words might contain. The judgment was delivered in the throne room with the full weight of Asgardian formality, which meant that what was essentially a father sentencing a son was conducted in the language of a king, addressing a threat to the realm, and the distance between those two framings was a distance that neither Odin nor Loki moved to close. Odin spoke in the measured cadences of someone who has made a decision and is presenting it rather than arriving at it, which meant the outcome had been determined before the proceeding began, which was perhaps inevitable given the nature of what Loki had done and the nature of the position Odin occupied. The sentence was imprisonment, indefinite, in the dungeons beneath the palace, in the cells that were reserved for those whose capabilities made ordinary confinement inadequate. There was no conversation about the void, about what had been found there and by what, about the sceptre and its specific properties, about the sequence of events that had begun with a revelation in a vault and ended with a god lying in a crater on a distant planet. There was the sentence, and the guards, and the long walk down. The dungeons beneath Asgard's golden towers were not what the contrast might suggest. Not dark, not damp, not the crude stone chambers of lesser civilizations' imaginations. They were, in their way, as beautiful as the rest of the palace, lit by the same quality of ambient light, constructed with the same attention to material and craft, simply organized around principles of containment rather than welcome. Each cell was large enough for comfortable habitation, furnished with the things that made long occupation bearable: books, writing materials, surfaces on which to work and think. The magical barriers that separated the inhabitants from the corridors were more or less invisible, which meant that the confinement announced itself not in physical obstruction, but in the precise and humiliating clarity of its boundary, in the fact that you could see everything and touch nothing beyond the line, which is perhaps the more psychologically accurate representation of what imprisonment actually means. Loki's cell became, in the days immediately following his arrival, a portrait of a person choosing to perform indifference, rather than experience whatever was actually present beneath it. He arranged the space with the particular precision of someone who is exerting control over the only domain currently available to him, placed the books in an order that meant something to him alone, sat in the corner that caught the best light at the hour he preferred to read, and presented to anyone who passed the exterior image of someone entirely comfortable with his circumstances, which was a performance of such obvious artificiality that it would have been almost comic if it had not been so clearly a person protecting themselves with the only tool immediately to hand. He had other tools, of course. The magical capabilities that had defined him since childhood were not removed by imprisonment. They could not be removed. Being as much a part of his fundamental nature as the colour of his eyes, or the specific quality of his intelligence, but they were, within the confines of the cell, largely without external application, which meant they turned inward in the way that strong rivers turn when they encounter a barrier, not ceasing to flow, but finding different channels for their movement. He practiced things that had no audience. He refined the precision of illusions that no one would see, held complex transformations for the discipline of holding them, rather than for any practical purpose, worked through the deep structural exercises of Seidr that Frigga had taught him, with the concentration of someone who is choosing the quality of their own interior life because the exterior life has been placed beyond their management. Frigga came. She came with the regularity and the determination of someone who has decided that presence is a form of argument, that requires no words to make its case. Who understands that the most important thing she can offer is simply the continued fact of herself, her refusal to reclassify the person in the cell as something other than the person she has always known him to be. She came and she sat on her side of the barrier and she talked to him about small things, about the business of the palace, about books she was reading and magical problems she was working through, about the quality of the weather in the upper reaches of Asgard where the atmosphere took on particular colours in certain seasons. She talked to him the way you talk to someone who is present and listening, even when they are performing the opposite of both, because she knew him well enough to know that the performance of absence was itself a form of presence, that the very effort of pretending not to care was evidence of how much he did. He responded eventually, because he could not respond to Frigga. She was the one relationship in his life that had never required him to manage his responses in the direction of a particular effect, the one context in which the exhausting work of calibration could be set down for a while without catastrophic consequence. The conversations they had through the barrier of his cell were among the most honest of his life. which is perhaps not surprising given that the usual alternatives to honesty, action, scheme, the conversion of feeling into strategic purpose, had been removed from his available repertoire by the specific fact of his confinement. There was nothing to do except sit with what was true, and Frigga's company made that sitting bearable in ways that solitude would not have. She taught him, still, from her side of the barrier. The instruction continued as it had in the warm afternoon rooms of his childhood, adapted to the circumstances with the flexibility that had always characterized her pedagogy. She would work through a magical problem aloud, describing her process, and he would follow the description and respond with his own analysis, and the exchange had the quality of their best conversations from before, the quality of two minds engaging with something genuinely interesting, without the requirement that either mind perform a role other than the one it actually occupied. These sessions were not consolation. They were continuation, which was a more radical offer, the offer of someone who refuses to allow a change in circumstances to constitute a change in relationship. Odin did not come. His absence was its own presence in the cell, as it had always been a presence in Loki's life. The father who was everywhere in principle and so often absent in practice, whose love was real but expressed in forms that were frequently illegible to the person it was directed toward, who seemed to believe that provision and protection constituted the full vocabulary of parental care, and who had never quite developed fluency in the dialect of simple presence without agenda. Loki did not speak about this absence to Frigga, and Frigga did not raise it, and the silence between them on the subject had the quality of a shared understanding, that some wounds were better allowed to close at their own pace, rather than being kept open by examination. Thor came twice in the early months. The visits had the specific discomfort of interactions between people who have a great deal to say to each other, and have not yet found a way to begin saying it, who circle the important things with the elaborate indirection of those who fear that direct approach might produce an irreversible rupture. Thor asked how he was. Loki said something that was not an answer. Thor described things that were happening in the realm and beyond it, filling the space with information the way people fill space when silence is too heavy to sustain. Loki listened and responded with observations that were sometimes genuine, and sometimes designed to end the conversation by making it uncomfortable, depending on how much of his actual interior he was willing to expose in any given moment. What passed between them in those visits was not nothing. It was not the honest reckoning that the situation called for and that neither of them was yet equipped to have. But it was the maintenance of a thread, thin, unreliable, tested by the weight placed on it, that had not been entirely severed by everything that had happened. And the maintenance of it was itself a kind of statement about what they both, despite everything, continued to choose. The psychological work of the dungeon years was not dramatic in any externally visible sense. It did not announce itself in transformations of behaviour or attitude that a passing observer could have catalogued. It happened in the quality of the silence between 1 hour and the next, in the slow process of a mind that had been operating in crisis beginning to find, through the forced removal of the usual distractions, something closer to its actual ground. The questions that the revelation of his origins had raised could not be answered through action. He had tried that comprehensively, and the attempt had produced the cell in which he now sat. They could only be approached through the patient, uncomfortable discipline of simply remaining present with them, of allowing the discomfort to exist without immediately converting it into something more manageable. He was Jotun and he was Asgardian, and he was neither of these things in the way that either identity was usually understood, because he had been shaped by the intersection rather than the centre of either, and the intersection was a position that had no established name and no clear precedent, and required, therefore, a kind of self-understanding that could not simply be borrowed from existing categories, but had to be built from his own specific materials. This building was slow work. It was work that confinement, despite everything, created conditions for in a way that the chaos of action had not. The forced stillness that had felt at first like punishment gradually revealing itself as something more ambiguous, a space in which things that had been moving too fast to be seen clearly could finally be seen. The other inhabitants of the dungeon cells were a varied collection, and Loki observed them with the particular quality of attention that had been his characteristic mode since childhood, now applied to the specific social ecosystem of a confined population. He did not make friends among them. He was not, in this period, making friends in any sense. but he observed the patterns of how people conducted themselves when their usual external roles had been stripped away, how identity maintained or reconstructed itself in the absence of the circumstances that normally confirmed it, how people who had defined themselves through action or status found other ways to understand who they were when action and status were temporarily unavailable. He found in these observations material for thoughts that surprised him with their direction. The prisoners who managed their confinement with the most apparent equanimity were not those who had been most powerful or most certain in their identities before their imprisonment, but those who seemed to have some relationship with themselves that existed independently of external confirmation, who were not entirely dependent on the world's response to them for their understanding of their own value. He had always thought of himself as someone whose intelligence and capability constituted that independent ground, had believed that what he could do was the stable core around which everything else was organized. But what he could do had produced the cell, which suggested that capability was not, by itself, the thing he was looking for, and that the ground he needed was something else, located somewhere he had not yet fully looked. The months accumulated into something approaching a year, and then beyond it, and the life inside the cell developed the particular texture of lives that have accepted their own constraints without being defined by them, full of small, meaningful activities, of reading and thinking and the continued conversations with Frigga, of the slow interior work whose progress was not visible from outside, and whose results would not be apparent until circumstances changed and revealed what the work had produced. He was not happy. He was not at peace. But he was, in ways that had not been true in the years immediately preceding his fall, becoming marginally more acquainted with the actual contents of his own interior, and that acquaintance, however uncomfortable, was the beginning of something that would take a very long time to develop, but that had, in the quiet of the dungeon and the continued warmth of his mother's presence, at least found its starting point. He read everything available to him twice, and some things more than twice. He refined his magical capabilities to a precision that exceeded anything he had achieved before, because there was nothing else to do with the time, and because the refinement was interesting in itself, because excellence in something that he genuinely loved was a form of self-possession that the cell could not remove from him. He maintained his illusions, perfect and complex and seen by no one, because making them was its own reward. Because the craft of a thing well made has value that exists independently of whether anyone witnesses the making, and he waited in the way that people wait who have learned that forcing the resolution of things that have their own pace produces worse outcomes than patience, not the passive waiting of someone who has given up on influencing their circumstances, but the active waiting of someone who is using the interval to become more ready for whatever the circumstances eventually produce. Something would change. Things always changed. The question was what kind of person the stillness was building toward the change, and that was the question he was, in his measured and unsentimental way, doing the slow work of answering. The waiting ended, as waiting tends to end. Not through any resolution of the things that made it necessary, but through the arrival of something entirely new that rendered the existing circumstances suddenly insufficient to contain what the moment required. The Dark Elves came to Asgard with the specific purposefulness of a very old grievance that has been patient for a very long time, and has finally identified the conditions under which patience can give way to action, and what they did when they arrived changed everything, not through the grandeur of cosmic conflict, but through the intimate, irreversible particularity of a single loss that reorganized the entire emotional architecture of everyone it touched. Frigga died defending Jane Foster in the royal chambers. The facts of it are simple in the way that the most devastating facts tend to be simple. A confrontation, a refusal to yield, an ending. She was a woman of extraordinary capability who had spent her life using that capability in service of the people she loved. And she spent the last of it in exactly that way, which was consistent with everything she had ever been, and which provided precisely zero comfort to the people who had needed her to continue. The blade that Malekith's lieutenant carried was real in ways that Asgardian magic could not entirely counter, and the woman who had taught Loki everything he knew about the deep structure of reality, who had sat on her side of a prison barrier and maintained the thread of their relationship through the sheer force of her continued presence, who had loved him without condition from the first moment she received him as a small, cold, unnamed thing from the void. That woman was gone, and the goneness of her was the kind that does not reverse, that does not offer second chances or alternative approaches, that simply and completely and permanently removes something from the world that the world cannot replace. Loki learned of it in the cell. He learned of it the way prisoners learn of things that happen beyond their confinement, through the changed quality of the atmosphere, through the particular way that guards moved in the corridors outside, through the aggregate of small signals that a perceptive person reads in the behaviour of others before any direct communication arrives. He knew before he was told, which meant that the telling, when it came, was confirmation rather than discovery, and confirmation of a thing you already know is in some ways worse than learning it fresh, because you have already had the moment of impact and the confirmation simply extends it, makes it official, removes the last thin possibility that the reading was wrong. He did not perform anything in response to the news. This is worth noting because performance had been, for so long, his primary mode of managing his relationship with his own interior life, the conversion of feeling into gesture, of grief into scheme, of love into the oblique demonstrations that love takes when it cannot find direct expression. There was no performance available to him in that moment that would have served any purpose. There was only the fact, and the cell around it, and the particular silence of a person who has lost the one relationship that required nothing of them except to be present and receive what was freely offered. He wept, eventually, in the private hours when the corridors outside were quiet, and the light had changed to the quality it took on when Asgard's long night was deepest. He wept with the specific, unmanaged quality of grief that bypasses the usual architecture of self-presentation, because the person who most made self-presentation feel unnecessary is the one who is gone, and therefore the usual reason to maintain composure, the maintenance of an image for someone whose perception of you matters, has been removed at the same moment as the source of the grief itself. It was grief without an audience, which is the purest kind, and it lasted for a long time, and when it receded it left behind something that was not peace but was, perhaps, the specific hollowed-out clarity that follows the full expenditure of feeling. The state in which the truth of things is briefly legible without the distortion of wanting them to be different. Thor came. He came differently than he had come before, not with the careful social navigation of the earlier visits, not circling the important things with the elaborate indirection of someone who fears the approach. He came with the direct, stripped-down presence of a person who has also just experienced something that has removed the usual reasons for indirection, and he stood in front of the barrier to Loki's cell and said nothing for a moment, and the nothing that he said contained within it the entire weight of what they shared in that moment, which was the loss of the person who had been the centre of warmth in both of their lives. What passed between them in those first minutes was not words but the older communication that exists beneath words, the recognition of shared grief in another person's face, the acknowledgement that whatever had divided them was, in this moment, less present than what had always connected them, the specific relief of being with someone who loved the same person and is therefore capable of understanding the specific shape of the absence. Thor's eyes were red. Loki's composure, which he had reassembled in the hours since the news arrived with the careful precision of someone reconstructing something they know will need to hold, was not entirely intact, and he did not make the effort to fully restore it before Thor arrived, which was itself a statement of something. Thor proposed the alliance. He came not only to grieve but to ask, which was characteristic of him. The inability to remain still in the face of a wrong that could potentially be addressed through action was perhaps his most consistent quality across all the years of his development, and grief for Thor had always had a way of converting rapidly into the desire to do something about its cause. He wanted to go after Malekith. He wanted to take Jane Foster beyond Asgard's walls, beyond the range of whatever intelligence the Dark Elves had used to locate her, and he wanted Loki's help to do it, because Loki knew the secret paths between the realms, the hidden passages through the dimensional structure that official channels did not use and therefore could not be anticipated by enemies monitoring those channels. The request placed Loki in a position he had not occupied in a very long time, the position of being genuinely needed for something that mattered, being asked to contribute the specific capabilities he actually possessed, rather than being managed or contained or sentenced. It also placed him in the position of being asked by Thor, which was its own complexity, the complexity of a relationship that had been damaged and left partially unrepaired, and that was now, under the pressure of shared loss, revealing that the damage had not penetrated as deep as the circumstances of the past years might have suggested. He agreed. He agreed with the characteristic sideways quality of his agreements, not directly and not entirely without the self-protective cover of apparent reluctance. Because he was not yet, and perhaps never entirely, would be someone who could simply say yes to the things he wanted, without the defensive apparatus of making the yes look like something other than what it was. But the agreement was real beneath the manner of it, and Thor knew this, and neither of them required the other to perform a sincerity that was already present, and simply wearing its usual disguise. The release from the cell was temporary, conditional, and clearly communicated as such by everyone involved, including the guards who flanked them as they moved through the palace corridors toward the point of departure. Loki wore the appearance of someone treating the conditionality with the light ironic distance that was his characteristic mode of engaging with restrictions on his freedom, and beneath this appearance he was in fact doing something rather more complex, processing the experience of moving through space again after the long confinement, of having the world expand around him after its extended compression to the dimensions of a cell, of being in the company of his brother in circumstances that were not the managed visits of the imprisonment period, but something more like the old shared purpose of their childhood misadventures, stripped of the innocence but retaining some essential quality of the partnership. They argued because they were themselves, and argument was one of the primary languages of their relationship. The arguments had the specific quality of arguments between people who are using disagreement as a way of being in contact with each other, who find in the friction of opposing perspectives a kind of intimacy that more direct expressions of closeness would require vulnerabilities neither of them was fully prepared to offer. Loki transformed Thor's appearance, which was both practically necessary for the deception and personally satisfying in a way that he did not entirely conceal. And Thor endured this with the good-humoured resignation of someone who has decided that this particular battle is not worth fighting because it will not actually harm anything important. There were moments during their passage through the hidden paths between the realms when something shifted between them, brief, unannounced moments in which the architecture of their estrangement became temporarily permeable, and what existed beneath it was briefly accessible. A shared glance at a particular stretch of the dimensional passage that neither of them had seen before. A moment when Loki navigated a difficult transition, and Thor's hand was briefly on his shoulder, steadying, without either of them remarking on it. The specific quality of silence between people who have known each other since before either of them had defences to maintain, and who in certain unguarded moments simply are who they are to each other without the mediation of history or grievance. The mission to Svartalfheim carried within it, for Loki, a dimension that no one else in the party was positioned to perceive. He was moving through the universe in service of a goal that was his brother's more than his own, in grief for a woman whose death had not been required by any action of his, using capabilities that had been developed in love and refined in imprisonment, and the combination of these things produced in him a quality of presence that was different from the performance of previous actions, more grounded, less mediated by the layers of strategic calculation that usually separated his intentions from their expression. He was also, inevitably, watching Thor's interaction with Jane Foster and what it revealed about how his brother had changed during the years of their separation, the increased patience, the genuine quality of his regard for this particular human woman, the way that care for someone fragile had developed in him, a delicacy that his earlier self had not possessed. Watching the landscape of Svartalfheim, which was what a world looked like after its inhabitants had pursued their purposes to the complete exhaustion of the world's capacity to sustain them, which was information of a kind that he was always collecting and always filing for later consideration. Watching himself, with the increased willingness to look that the cell had, slowly and at great cost, begun to develop in him. When the battle came, Loki fought beside Thor with the full investment of his capabilities, which was not the performance of alliance but the real thing, the actual commitment of his intelligence and his magic, and his considerable tactical understanding to the shared objective, without the reservation that previous collaborative efforts had always contained. He was hurt in the fighting, struck by forces that his magic could deflect, but not entirely absorb, and he endured the pain with the specific quality of endurance that characterizes people who are discovering that they are willing to sustain costs for goals that are actually their own rather than assigned to them. The moment came when he appeared to die. The mechanics of it, the blade, the specific physical consequences, Thor's response, are part of the record. What is less part of the record is what the experience was for Loki, which was not death, but was also not nothing, was a proximity to genuine ending that clarified, with the brutal efficiency of extreme circumstances, what actually mattered to him and what did not. What mattered to him was present in the expression on Thor's face as he knelt and held his brother in the dust of Svartalfheim, the grief that Thor could not manage in that moment, the complete absence of any strategic consideration in his response, the rawness of a person encountering the prospective loss of someone they love before they have finished saying what they needed to say. That mattered. It mattered with a directness and a specificity that cut through the entire accumulated architecture of Loki's habitual self-protection and touched something that the architecture had been built to protect, which was the simple, unguarded fact of how much his brother meant to him, and how much the loss of that meaning to their relationship had cost him, which he had never been able to say directly, and which the apparent ending of things was making briefly, devastatingly available. He did not die. He allowed the appearance of death to complete itself, and then he did not die. And the choice to allow the appearance and to survive behind it was a choice made from a mixture of motivations that he himself could not have entirely disentangled in that moment. Survival instinct, habitual recourse to concealment, the specific opportunity that apparent death provided for a kind of freedom that living as himself in Asgard had not offered, and beneath all of these the complicated, unresolved grief of someone who had lost his mother and had spent a few days in genuine partnership with his brother, and had found in both experiences a quality of connection that the subsequent plan, whatever its failures, was partly an attempt to preserve the conditions for, even if the preservation took a form that was comprehensible only from very deep inside his particular way of understanding the world. He returned to Asgard as someone else, and he ruled as someone else, and the someone else he ruled as was shaped by everything that the cell and the mission and the grief and the brief, uncalculated moments with Thor had produced in him. Not a better version of himself exactly, not yet, but a version that was doing something different with the materials, something that was reaching, however inadequately and however obliquely, toward the life he might have lived if the circumstances had been different. It was not the right approach. It was the approach available to someone who had learned a great deal and had not yet learned enough, who was still using the tools of concealment for purposes that concealment was not adequate to serve. But Frigga was gone, and her absence was in everything. In the quality of the light in the rooms where they had worked together, in the silence where her voice had been, in the specific texture of a life from which the person most capable of receiving its truth had been permanently removed. He carried that absence into everything that followed, as people carry the absences of those who love them best, not as a weight exactly, but as a changed relationship with the world, a knowledge that certain things had been possible in her presence that could not be replicated without her, and a long patient grief for all of those things, which would continue quietly beneath everything else for as long as he existed. The years that followed Frigga's death and Loki's apparent end on Svartalfheim were years in which Asgard continued in its golden confidence without fully realizing that the person tending its continuity was not the person it believed him to be. The palace maintained its routines. The court convened and dispersed and convened again. The realm's business proceeded with the competent regularity of an institution that had been operating long enough to carry much of its own momentum, requiring less active governance than it appeared to require, which was fortunate given that the governance it was receiving was being conducted by someone who was simultaneously trying to rule a kingdom and process the entirely unfinished business of his own interior life. Loki wore Odin's face the way he had worn everything throughout his life, with technical perfection and existential ambivalence. The disguise was flawless in every external detail, every inflection of the All-Father's voice, every characteristic gesture, every pattern of attention and response that the court had spent centuries learning to read as confirmation of the person they were dealing with. No one in the daily operations of Asgardian governance had any reason to suspect that the figure on the throne was not the figure who had always occupied it, and this absence of suspicion was itself a kind of information. Information about how much of what we believe we are responding to in the people we know is actually a pattern we have constructed from accumulated exposure, a pattern that can be reproduced sufficiently accurately by someone with the right capabilities and sufficient motivation. What Loki did with the throne was revealing in ways that he himself might not have fully recognized as revealing. The first significant acts of his rule were not aggressive or self-aggrandizing in any simple sense. He ceased the wars that Odin's policies had kept perpetually threatening to ignite, withdrew Asgardian forces from positions of contested projection, declined provocations that the real Odin would likely have met with the measured display of force that had kept certain boundaries stable for centuries. These were not obviously wrong decisions. Some of them were arguably more genuinely peaceful than the policies they replaced, and the absence of ongoing military engagement produced a quality of ease in Asgard's international relations that the realm had not experienced for some time. This, Loki arranged without particular fanfare, as though it was simply what sensible governance looked like. The statue was different. The great stone monument commissioned in honour of Loki's sacrifice, erected in a public space where Asgardians passed it daily and were invited to pause and reflect on the courage it commemorated, had an unmistakable quality of personal investment that the other decisions lacked. He designed it himself, overseeing details that a regent with genuinely disinterested motivations would have delegated entirely, specifying the particular angle of the depicted figure's posture and the expression the stone face should carry, which was an expression he had chosen because it was the expression he had always wanted someone to see in him and had never been entirely certain they did. The monument was, in its way, an act of self-portraiture conducted in public stone by someone who could not sign his name to the work, which contained within it the specific pathos of Loki's situation in miniature, the person who most wanted to be seen clearly, expressing himself through a disguise. The theatrical productions were similarly diagnostic. He commissioned plays depicting the events of the Dark World mission, ensuring that the dramatic retelling centered on the sacrifice of the fallen prince, in terms that gave the character full credit for the courage and love that the real events had, in their complicated way, actually contained. Watching Asgardians watch these productions, watching them moved by a version of events that was both a fiction and, in its essential emotional truth, not entirely false, gave him something that he would have struggled to name precisely. A complicated satisfaction that contained genuine feeling alongside the irony of knowing himself to be the only person in the theatre fully positioned to evaluate the accuracy of what was being depicted. He was not entirely alone in his occupation of the deception. The day-to-day work of ruling required interactions with individuals whose proximity and attentiveness created conditions under which the maintenance of the disguise demanded continuous effort, and certain of these interactions accumulated into something approaching genuine complexity. The court wizard, the palace staff, the various ministers whose portfolios required regular consultation, these people engaged with him daily in ways that mapped against their existing understanding of who he was, and the management of those maps required a quality of sustained attention that was, even for someone of his capabilities, not nothing. He also, in the quieter hours, had conversations with Odin, with the real Odin. Or what remained of the real Odin, which was a question whose full dimensions he had not yet confronted directly. He had not killed his father. This is a point that later accounts sometimes fail to establish clearly, and its clarity matters. He had displaced him, had used magic to move the Allfather to a place where he was cared for and comfortable, and effectively absent from the situation. And he had done this because the situation at the time of Frigga's death and his own apparent end had offered no obvious alternative that would have produced the specific freedom he needed, and because the act of displacement was more consistent with who he was than the alternatives would have been. He was many things, and he had done things that had caused serious harm. He had not killed his father, and he had not killed his brother, and these were not incidental facts about the limits of his worst impulses. The disguise held for longer than might have been expected, and not as long as he might have hoped. The internal pressures of the deception were not dramatic in any single instance, but cumulative. The sustained effort of never quite being able to respond to anything as himself. The strange grief of being publicly mourned by a realm that did not know it was mourning him. The particular disorientation of receiving expressions of respect and affection directed toward a face that was not his own, which produced in him a feeling that was the opposite of what being seen feels like, and that he was, after everything, increasingly tired of experiencing. Thor's return was therefore both dreaded and in some way not entirely unwelcome. The complication of Thor's presence was that Thor was the person most likely to perceive the deception, not because his powers of observation were equal to Loki's, but because his knowledge of their father was intimate and experiential, and included dimensions of personal history that could not be adequately replicated through research and imitation alone. The disguised Loki had maintained the broad external patterns of Odin's behaviour with precision, but the specific unpredictable quality of how a father behaves with his elder son, the particular texture of that relationship with all its loaded history, was the dimension where the performance was most likely to develop perceptible discontinuities. He managed the early interactions with the careful overconfidence that was his characteristic failure mode, the tendency, when concerned about detection, to overplay the performance rather than trusting its existing quality, to add details that called attention to themselves precisely because they were designed to deflect attention. Thor was perceptive in his own way, and the interactions were uncomfortable in the way of someone pressing a bruise repeatedly and not quite understanding why the pressure produces the response it does. Loki deflected and redirected and offered Odin's characteristic pronouncements on the unimportance of further quests and the satisfactions of established peace, and Thor received these deflections with the particular expression of someone who knows something is wrong and has not yet identified what it is. The unmasking arrived through the combined effect of Mjolnir and a moment of characteristic overreach. In the attempt to finally discourage Thor from the further investigations that threatened to produce awkward revelations, the Loki as Odin performance tipped past the point of sustainable plausibility into something that Thor's knowledge of his father identified as simply not right. Not in any single dramatic detail, but in the aggregate quality of the wrongness, the accumulated texture of responses that were consistent with an idea of Odin rather than with Odin himself. The hammer that only the worthy could lift confirmed what Thor's instincts had been signalling, and Loki released the disguise. The moment of unmasking was, in its actual emotional character, less dramatic than either of them had perhaps anticipated. The revelation was confirmation rather than discovery for Thor, who had felt the wrongness for long enough that the naming of it produced more resolution than shock. For Loki it was the relief, complicated, slightly desperate, not entirely welcome, of a person who has been maintaining a performance for an extended period and has reached the point where the maintenance is costing more than the performance is providing. The exhaustion of it was briefly visible before he reassembled his composure, and Thor saw it and filed it alongside the other things he was learning, slowly, about his brother's interior. The conversation that followed was not the reckoning that the situation called for and that both of them needed, because neither of them had yet developed sufficient access to the honesty that such a reckoning required. But it was a conversation, which was more than they had managed in the years preceding it, and it included, beneath the anger and the accusations and the characteristic mutual deflection, certain moments of genuine contact, moments when what was said corresponded however briefly and however imperfectly to what was actually meant. Thor needed to find Odin. This was the immediate practical requirement, and it was a requirement that implied Loki's cooperation, because Loki was the only person who knew where Odin was. The cooperation that Loki offered was not without complication, and the journey that the offer set in motion took them to Midgard and to the particular figure that Odin had been left in the care of, which was a situation whose full absurdity Loki could appreciate, even through the discomfort of the circumstances. Odin was found in Norway, at the edge of a cliff that faced the sea, and he was not the Odin that either of them had brought their accumulated grievances to in their imaginations. He was diminished in the specific way of very old, very powerful things that have been worn down by time past, the point where the power and the age are the primary perceptible qualities, the surface giving way to something beneath it that was, in its own way, more essentially himself than the imposing. Strategically reticent figure on the throne had often been. He was dying, which was not something that either of his sons had been prepared to encounter as a present-tense fact, rather than an abstract eventual possibility. What Odin said in those final hours was not sufficient to repair everything that had remained unrepaired between them. It could not have been. The deficit of honest communication that had accumulated over centuries could not be addressed adequately in the time remaining, and Odin was not, even at the end, a man who found direct emotional expression easily or naturally. But he tried, with whatever remained available to him, in the specific way of people who recognize too late that the postponements they have been making were postponements of things that mattered enormously, and that can no longer be postponed without being lost entirely. He told Loki that he loved him. He told both of them, together. At the edge of the Norwegian cliff with the sea below and the light of a late afternoon falling on all three of them, that they were both his sons, not in the elaborate politically contextualized language that had always surrounded that particular truth in the past, but simply, directly, as a fact he was naming because the time for surrounding it with qualifications had run out. He said this to Loki with the direct eye contact of someone who has decided that the remaining time is too short for anything other than the full delivery of what needs to be said, and Loki received it with the expression of a person who has been waiting to hear something for a very long time, and finds, in the hearing of it, that the hearing is both everything they hoped and insufficient to repair what the waiting has cost. Odin dissolved into golden light at the cliff's edge, which was as appropriate an ending for the Allfather as any other. Not a death in the usual sense, but a dispersal. A return of an enormous quantity of accumulated existence to the larger fabric of things from which it had once been gathered. He was gone, and the two brothers stood at the edge of the cliff in the aftermath of his going, and the sea continued its indifferent work against the rocks below, and for a few minutes neither of them spoke, because what the moment required was not words, but the simple shared fact of being present with the lost together. Something shifted in that silence, not dramatically, not in ways that announce themselves as transformation, but something shifted. The quality of the air between them, perhaps, or the quality of their individual relationships to the distance that had been growing between them for so long. They had both now lost the same parents, in the same compressed period of time, and the shared losses created a different kind of ground between them than the shared history of conflict had been producing. Shared grief is not reconciliation. It is not the resolution of real grievances or the repair of genuine wounds. But it is a form of recognition of the other person's loss as equivalent in weight to your own, recognition that the same things mattered to both of you, even when you were moving in opposite directions, recognition that the story you share is longer and more complicated than the most recent chapters have suggested. They stood together at the edge of the cliff for a while longer, and then they turned away from the sea, and the next chapter of what they were to each other began. Not cleanly, not without the weight of everything that had preceded it, but with the particular quality of beginnings that occur after the thing you have both been circling has finally been named and stood beside, and in its naming and its standing beside revealed to be something that neither of you has to carry entirely alone. And so we rest here, at the edge of Loki's long and searching journey, in the quiet that follows a story that has finally found its shape. What this story has always been, beneath the magic and the mischief and the long distances travelled between worlds, is the story of a person learning, slowly, at great cost, through loss and pride, and the gradual, difficult willingness to look honestly at themselves, that belonging is not a place you find, but a truth you arrive at, and that the self you've been searching for was never as far away as the searching made it seem. You have travelled tonight through grief and transformation, through the particular courage it takes to remain open after everything has been taken, through the discovery that love does not require its object to have been perfect in order to be real and lasting and worth carrying forward. Let that be the thing you carry into sleep now, the quiet knowledge that the searching has its own value, that the ones who loved you knew you and chose you, and that being known and chosen is enough. The branches of the world tree hold everything tonight. Every story, every loss, every moment of unexpected grace. Rest now. You are held.